Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi Achint. Africa, a continent with a lot of turmoil, but has been in the news quite a lot. We as a country has been trying to make an outreach into Africa, and suddenly the whole thing just kind of exploded on the scene with two, three things. One, the coup which happened in Niger and Gabon. Two, Prime Minister's visit to South Africa and the talks of Africa in that point, and the G20, which is planning to bring in the whole of African Union within it. To discuss this very intricate affair, I have with me someone really special, Ambassador Anil Trigunath, who's actually spent a lot of time in that region. He was a former ambassador of Jordan, Libya, Malta, and of course, with a career spanning decades, he's going to be able to tell us and give us an insight as to what's happening in that great continent. Sir, thank you so much for taking out the time and joining me on this show.
Thank you, Adi, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure's all mine, sir. So, what's happening in Africa? A lot of people say that there is a pushback towards colonialism. Especially the French seem to be taking a lot of beat in terms of their presence in West Africa and the Afrique du Nord, as it's known as. What's happening in that region, sir? I'd like you to help us understand that before we get into the India, China, and the rest of the angles.
Well, Adi, the thing is that Africa, as you know, is currently a continent with about 55 countries in it. And this is a continent which is somewhat disconnected with one another. There is an effort currently by the countries to bring about certain kind of an integration, especially the economic integration. There is an African Continental Free Trade Agreement that they are negotiating with or nearly done it. There is an African Union which has come up with an Agenda 2063, whereby they want to see Africa as a prosperous and developed country. It has roughly about 1.4 billion population as ours, almost, and it is the richest continent in the world. And that is its brain also at the same time. And that is why we have seen nearly every major colonial power making their forays into it, whether it is British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, all of them. They will be speaking in Portuguese in Sao Tome Principe and Gabon, some other countries. So they have this kind of historic connect. Now, as you know, that after India achieved its independence, the first thing that the Indian leadership started doing was to fight against colonialism, because that is exploitative in nature. And we fought for it. There was non-aligned movement, and with Ghana, with some other countries, Prime Minister at that time, Nehru, went around this tirade, whether in the United Nations or otherwise, and eventually a very large number of countries were liberated and got their independence. Most of them through these demonstrations and pressures, and the result of the Second World War, as you know, when the British Empire, the other empires had really were decimated. But these countries did not have the sufficient wherewithal, the institutional mechanisms, because most of the mechanisms, as you know, were created to serve the interests of the colonial power. And in French, you mentioned about the French colonies. The Britishers were hated wherever they were, because they tried to discriminate. They were racist in nature, whether it is in India. I had written somewhere recently, I had said that in my own hometown, Nainital, which is a hill station, there is a mall road. And I was told by my grandfather or others that it was written there that the Indians and dogs were not allowed. So you can imagine that with that kind of an approach, it was bound to be a hatred at the grassroots level. And so that's what happened. And so Britishers, once they left really. They were not so much embedded into those countries which they ruled for so long time. So it was the biggest empire on whom the sun never set. But it set, once it set, it never rose. That is the thing. We have recently surpassed the UK to become the fifth largest economy. Now, and we have also Indian origin Prime Minister in UK who is visiting India currently. Now, again, back to Africa, I think that you'll realize that the Francophone Africa was very different. And I went to France in 1983 to Africa, Francophone Africa. A country was called Ivory Coast, which was later named as Côte d'Ivoire. Now, in Côte d'Ivoire, it was a French colony earlier, like many other. There's a West African, many countries which were the French colonies. And there, I was surprised once I saw it. It was a very beautiful country, very developed capital. And so you could see that it was like a show window of the French to Africa and to the world. So you could, when you see that. Then there was a single party rule in the country. The leader of the country at that time, Houphouët-Boigny, was virtually, he fought against the French to some extent, but then he realized that he needed them to support his continuation as a leader. So what I found was that, and there was some kind of a statistics that can be right or wrong, 5% here and there, but some statistics which I read those days is that nearly 83 to 85% of the government decision making in the country was controlled by the French. And therefore, how did they do it? Under every minister, there was a directeur du cabinet, which is like your permanent secretary or a little above him. And that guy was the key to all decisions that were to be taken, and he was a Frenchman mostly. But the French has something different. They tried to have their cultural conquest also. So they even tried to change the language, the habit, the currency, everything was taken there. So everybody just started learning that. And then they were also trying to have intermarriages. I mean, French were not that racist in that sense of the term. You could find a lot of women, French women married to Africans and others. So this was something that went on like that. I mean, in Pondicherry, a lot of Indians also went and became French. And they were good accountants. So most of their embassies had the Indian accountants. And when I was there was a French rapid deployment force whose head was Colonel Ravi from Pondicherry. So you can imagine the kind of situation is this, that's why I always thought that the French were the smarter colonialists compared to the British. And so now that we are seeing the demise of the French Empire, frankly, in the 21st century. So 100, nearly almost 60, 70 years, they lasted easily without so much of a problem in most of these countries. But what has happened, like any colonial power, they look after their own interests. And that means tremendous exploitation, whether it is resources, whether it is slavery, whatever you may, human and otherwise. So this continues, benefits did not go. And unfortunately, the leaders they elected or selected, those leaders' interests were also not aligned to their own people. So they were only interested in their own personal wealth. They had palaces and the big houses in France or in Switzerland or somewhere else, building money. I mean, Nigerians, for example, own nearly 1/4 of UK, London city. So that is something that one has to remember, that these leaders have failed their own people. And they were supported because the contingents of the French army were kept in those places. And therefore, whenever there was a problem, then they would come and save this president or that president. But now, very recently, you have seen in some of the Francophone countries what is happening. We have seen in Niger recently, and Gabon also again. Then we had seen in Mali and Burkina Faso, which are totally against the Franc-Afrique kind of a thing that is happening. Now the French again you spoke about the Northern Africa. So I was ambassador to Libya. And Libya was in North Africa, and Gaddafi was the leader there. Gaddafi had a great friend in President Sarkozy. And Sarkozy would come and have great time in his tent business in the desert, all that, and even got 80 million euros funded for his elections. And eventually, he thought that if that gets exposed, then he might be barred from elections. And of course, later on, he was barred from the elections. But to avoid that, he enabled a situation where, despite Gaddafi trying his level best to be friends with them and do what the Western countries wanted, they went and bombed the place. And he drew NATO into it. And so we have seen the situation Libya has still not improved. Now, when you have these kind of situations, development is not there. People don't see anything. Most of the Africans are generally happy with the little that they get. You know, they are very happy if they get a little food, little this, some. But even if that is denied to them, then obviously, you know, people rise. And when people rise, then no regime can last. And that's precisely has happened. So I would personally say that Africa's the biggest misfortune can be probably termed with 4 C's, which I say. There's conflict, there is corruption, there is colonialism, and there are coups in the end. So that is what is marking it. Last 2-3 years or 6 years, we have seen several countries have been toppled by these military putschists. Before I move on to another one, let me just tell you, when I was posted in Nigeria, then Nigeria was also known with a lot of these coups that are happening one after the other. So some of the army officers there told me that anybody who rises to the rank of colonel dreams to become a head of a state one day. So that is another thing. Now, as far as India is concerned, we have had a great relationship with them. But after Pandit Nehru, I would say, 1960s, 62, I think he was the last he traveled in Africa or anywhere else. He was the only one who went to many countries in Africa. And he was loved by people. That is true. But at the same time, after that, the Indian governments just thought of Africa as being South Africa, nothing else beyond. South Africa is very Europeanized. So there, of course, it's very different. But no other country. When I was posted in Nigeria, we did not have a visit since 43 years by any prime minister or president or someone in the high level. So this was the story of every time. And we had a capacity building assistance program 1964 onwards, where we were providing assistance to them, but we followed a very ad hoc policy and very often a prescriptive kind of a policy. Okay, we are there are Indians who are doing business, this, that, all kinds of things, but not really trying to have a strategic approach to the region. So there was a lot of goodwill for India, it still is, but what they expected, they expect deliveries. They expect you to be engaged. So we have created these India-Africa Forum Summits. We are providing them scholarships. There are about 13 leaders who were educated in India, in the countries, and they are your best ambassadors, provided they have a good experience here in India. Because India also has, unfortunately, some sort of a racism which has not gone away. And we have this kind of attacks occasionally, and that really decimates a lot of efforts that the government or the other people are doing to maintain. Because see, any relationship, if it is not respected at the grassroots level, you will find it very difficult for it to be sustained. Chinese did it during the recent pandemic. Something happened, and you see the kind of ripple effect it had in Africa against them. So these things can go away. But under Prime Minister Modi, I must admit that the Africa policy was really devised. We did not have an Africa policy properly. I mean, if you call it giving assistance, giving this and that and all occasionally, I won't call it a proper policy. I would call it, okay, yes, they are there, so we need to work with them, that kind of a thing. But it has started differently. When he was traveling, I think in 2018 to Kampala, Uganda, then in the Ugandan parliament, he was giving an address. And at that, he came out with this 10 guiding principles. And those 10 guiding principles are actually our Africa policy today. The best part about that policy is that Africa for Africans. We are there to help. Whatever they want, we are going to give them. And that is something that has given a new direction to India's engagement with Africa once again. And I feel that one of the biggest problems that we have or we faced was the high level visits to these countries in Africa. We saw that during the last few years, we had 36, 37 visits by Prime Minister, President, Vice President, foreign ministers, ministers to the African countries. They keep coming here for many events. India-Africa Forum summits, we have had 3 of them. They come here for the CIA Exim Conclave, where a lot of ministers come. There are many mechanisms in which they've been coming here. But reciprocating the visit is very important at the highest level, because today the diplomacy is conducted at the highest level. So this was something that was missing. I think I'm happy that this gap has been filled, but we'll have to continue to maintain these efforts, because we are not alone in this arena. There are several actors who are trying to get in. Japan is the biggest ODA supplier. China is very much present there and has already got a lead over everyone else. Americans are trying to get back, despite Trump calling it a shithole. The French are trying to regain, but they are losing their influence rapidly. But still, Japan and the Germany and everybody else. So now we are working on trilateral, bilateral, and some of the Middle Eastern countries are also there. So we have to sort of have a consolidated, comprehensive strategy to be able to have a long-term impact. And it is in this context that you mentioned about the Africa Union becoming a part of the G20. Now, Prime Minister Modi has, of course, invited special invitees, apart from South Africa as a member of the G20, but has invited the Nigerian president, who has just landed today, Bola Tinubu. He has also invited the Mauritian. The Egyptian president is also coming. So outreach is increasing. That means you are attaching greater importance to them in your foreign policy. And that's that I would say is a very important development which is taking place and is on right track. One thing is there, that if we commit something, I would say, to that country, is any country, we must deliver it well in time. So your delivery decides how serious you are, frankly. And there sometimes we lack.
So you've given a roundup, I must say, that is going to be helpful for a lot of people to understand the continent and the outreach as well as relations with India. I'd like to take that a little forward, sir. Of course, there is problems within Africa, but there is a lot of potential as well. There was an interesting statement made by the president of South Africa during the BRICS summit, and he said Africa for Africans, and that's something which is now becoming a kind of a lingo. And second thing, he said that we would like to not sell stones and silica, rather as well sell finished products. So there's a yearning for industry to come in, which is where China kind of hawks into the place. And we saw in the past decade, the Chinese literally went into Africa, and I mean, countries like Angola, countries like Kenya got literally overrun by the Chinese. How do you see the Chinese in there today? And because we know there's also a pushback coming from a lot of the African countries to push back the Chinese thing. So how do you see the Chinese position there in the continent before we kind of get into a little deeper within India relations?
Well, I think that there is no doubt in denying the fact that China is the leader in Africa. They are virtually everywhere. But their model, which has served the purpose to some extent, has also created the problems for these countries because of their dead diplomacy, because of the way they work, and because of the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy that they follow. Eventually means, if you can't run the railways and you can't pay me, I will take over the railways, like what they did in Sri Lanka for the port. But China is not just doing it out of any beneficiation or out of charity. They are doing purely for business. They say we bring in investments, we bring in we build whatever you want, but at the same time you have to compromise on your resources. So oil, diamond, whatever is available, minerals, any kind of minerals, Chinese have got their long-term agreement signed with them. But one thing one should remember in these countries, that these leaders are not permanent forever. Bongo was there 55 years in Gabon. Now he's finished, gone. So whatever agreements you have signed with a leader, so as long as they're leader centric, there is always a danger of going back. So therefore, it is important that you have something that is appreciated by the people on the grassroots. So P2P connect is extremely important. I think that China everybody is scared of China in Africa. Most of the countries in Africa are also part of the BRI initiative, Belt and Road Initiative. So whether it is their ports, railways, or infrastructure, China has been planning it for 100-year plan. That creating a strategic, I would say, infrastructure, which in a certain eventuality can be used to its military advantage. Because China is looking itself to become a power number one in the world, numero uno, displacing United States. It will be or it will not be, time will only tell. But at the same time, it is working very consciously and Xi Jinping at least thinks that he has arrived. And so he's challenging the supremacy of the Western world order everywhere. Now, in that, most of the African countries are with them. My suggestion to my colleagues has been that please don't get very happy and contented just because China, some news item says that China is being criticized or a project has been taken away. That is nothing, because Chinese also adjust very fast. They have this something called FOCAC, which is like our India-Africa Forum Summit. So there's these annual foreign meetings which they hold in African country and in this. Now, we have not been able to hold the one from 2015 onwards, the last one. After that, it is already 5-6 years, I think, which are there, and we have not done it. Whereas the Chinese have continuously been doing it, Russians have done it, the Japanese have done their own Russian, even the Americans and the French and everybody else have been doing it. We don't do it. We have not been able to do it, which is what some kind of I would say, a little bit of a cause of dissatisfaction among Africans also. They say that we want India to be here. We want India to lead us and to come and work with us. And you rightly mentioned that they are no longer willing to be just the suppliers of raw materials. They want to have a value creation locally, supply to the other markets. So that will be the way for businesses to go there in that country. Because if you go with the capital, they have big markets. And it will become the most populous continent after 2050, because India's growth will then decline. So therefore, 2050 onwards, next 50, 40 years, it will be the African continent which will call the shots. So they will be the biggest market. They will be the biggest thing, and they're trying to integrate itself. So it is time for everybody in India, especially the businesses, to look at Africa seriously and in a long-term manner. If you are a fly-by-night operator, then it doesn't work. Government also must create special purpose vehicles for certain places. We must also have the shipping industry, which has been missing. In fact, we have recently at the Vivekananda Foundation made a report with recommendations to the government, exactly what in our view was missing and how it can be carried forward and maybe taken into account while the government of India moves forward further.
So interestingly, what we see is, as we were discussing offline, there's a battleground between India and China in pretty much every domain. Now, what you've kind of recommended and you've kind of hinted towards that India has gone in with a very soft touch. Sometimes, actually, till now at least, it's been very offhanded. It's not been very, consistent and stuff like that. But the Chinese have been a little more consistent, but they've gone in with a very hard touch. Now, in come the Russians, which have age-old relations with the Africans. I remember, I forget the name of the institute. They had these technical institutes, back in the CCCP days, the Soviet days. They had built up these technical institutes. They used to provide education for free. During the recent Africa-Russia summit, President Putin forgave $25 billion, and two started this particular thing back again, which was very popular back in the day. How do you see the Russians trying to come inside? Is it against China or is it with China, sir?
You see, it's a very interesting question. In fact, if you go by the real politic, I think every country looks after its own interests. But in certain situations, it is important to look at it in a bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral formats as well, where it serves your larger purpose. Now, it will all depend on which way the Russia-Ukraine war goes, what happens to the New World Order. The New World Order, if at all it is Cold War 2.0 kind, in that case, the Russia and China will be working together in Africa, in Middle East, elsewhere. And if it is just a multilateral kind of an order, then you will see countries working on their own mostly. And China is far too big in Africa or anywhere else, I would say, that it doesn't need any partners. China does not believe in alliances also, as you know, like us. We don't like alliance word. So China has its own arrangements, so to say. So Russia will depend on how Russia emerges out of this war. But in the meantime, what President Putin has done is that you see that during the Soviet times also, the socialist philosophy really attracted a lot of Africans. And they think that President Putin, a strong man, is still standing against the erstwhile colonial powers, still represents a force to reckon with and can be reliable. After what they did in Syria and in Libya and other places, I think the Russians have got a better market for themselves in Africa. China is not fearing the Russian presence in Africa. Rather, I think that China thinks that it is not a direct threat to them. Plus, Russia has also used this Wagner group. In about 20 countries, they are present in Africa. So they go and supply and help. America has done it with the Blackwater in different parts. So the Russians also have their similar kind of a thing. So but that is very effective. And they are part of, we have seen in Niger now, recently, you must have seen people running around with the Russian flags. So everybody said perhaps Russia was behind this coup. But if the Americans discounted it, they said, no, Russia was not, according to our opinion. It is French have done it themselves. So there was no need for anybody else to do it. But when a situation like that happens, any country that wants to play a little macho role will take advantage of that. And this is what Russia has done. So I see that Russia, China can collaborate in Africa. Russians can even collaborate with us, like the Americans want to collaborate with us, the French, the Japanese, everybody. Even we had Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which did not do much with Japan. We have certain projects with the Americans, with the French, with the Germans also in Africa, but nothing like that big. So I think that they wouldn't mind that, but China, of course, is looking at I think it's a solo journey at the moment for China.
Not a very big surprise, if I may. Sir, the question of Africa and the Russian influence within Africa has been brought about as a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, I don't know. It's another front for the Ukraine war. There are so many fronts opening up in this particular war, so it's again a battleground between East and West. How do you see the West, which is kind of rumored, has it, that they're pressuring the ECOWAS countries to kind of go inside and set the ball straight within Niger? Do you think this is another digging of a foundation for another regional war offshooting out of Ukraine?
Well, the problem is that ECOWAS is, as you know, 15 countries in the West, in Western Africa, and their office is located in Abuja. Now they have contributing armies, out of which Nigeria has the biggest army to contribute, and the biggest country as well. Nigeria recently had a presidential election, and the new president is there. He immediately wanted to exert it, that ECOWAS in the earlier case at Togo and elsewhere was able to do so, that bring them to books. But this time what has happened is that the Niger coup is basically supported also by Burkina Faso and Mali, the neighboring countries. So they said that if you are going to bring in ECOWAS or any French or Americans, anybody else wanting to come in here, then it will be an attack on us also. So they all three, four countries are going to fight together. Now, it will be a civil war. Now, why do the Americans and the French want it? Because there is this very big gas pipeline. The French are actually getting 20% of uranium from Niger. I used to cover Niger. In fact, when I was in 80s, I traveled to Niger many times. And it was a uranium, mines, the seventh largest in the world. And therefore, the French have direct supply to their uranium, to their power plants. And therefore, this supply, if it gets stopped, because Niger, military leaders have cancelled all agreements. They have asked the French ambassador to leave, their forces to leave and all that. Now, can you imagine when a country, irrespective of who is governing it, if they don't want you, man, you don't stay there, right? But they say, no, we don't recognize you, so we will continue to stay. Does that give you any brownie points with the people? People are saying that your time is over, get out. So this is the French Legion, which is there, about 1,500 forces, and Americans, about 1,000 of them. They are all covered and controlled by the people, of course, supported by the militia leaders. But they are all not allowing them to move out, and eventually they will have to leave. There is no this thing. But the initial reaction of the French was actually which will distance them further from the thing, because the people think that the leader, who was Bazouman, was basically a ploy or a toy in the hands of the French. So that's there. Now this pipeline which goes from Nigeria, gas pipeline through Niger and all, that is very important for the Nigerians also. So Nigerians have their own interest, and they're going to Europe, so Europeans have an interest, and Americans support that very much. Then there is a terror angle also. This whole extremism business is there. You have Al-Qaeda, you have ISIS, you have Boko Harams, you have Al-Shabaabs, all kinds of these groups which are operating in this part. And therefore, they will find this destabilizing place as a fertile ground for themselves. Now, I shouldn't be saying so. My Western friends don't agree with me. But invasion of Iraq was the mother of all evils, number one, which created the real terrorism, so to say, start of extremism and terrorism. And the invasion of Libya was again, has resulted into the extremism in this part of the world. Mali, Algeria, all these countries are being destabilized by these Islamists and extremist elements that have been brought in the beginning to fight Gaddafi, and today they've gone out of hand, like our friends in Pakistan do, unfortunately. Bhasmasura style, that. So this is the same story that it eventually, affects them. So I think that this is a bigger problem there, and they're no longer colonial powers. They should understand that the age of colonialism is passé.
It doesn't, I mean, it's a very funny sort of a situation that we talk about these kind of things even today in the 21st century. So
yeah.
So now coming to the real politic of it, and this is something I wanted to talk about. Even in BRICS, we saw an effort to integrate the African Union. The South Africans had brought in a lot of 35 countries, I think, attended. Their heads, I think, attended the BRICS summit. Mr. Modi is talking about literally making them G21. How do you think that is significant, and what kind of an impact will it have on the ground? Most likely it will go through, because the US is saying that we will work with.
No, everybody has agreed to that. Mostly.
Yeah. What kind of an impact will it have on the ground?
Adi, personally, I feel that if G20, we are able to make G20 into G21, that will be our biggest achievement. Because Africa is the future. And you bring in these 55 countries through African Union into this. Now you can imagine the clout of the whole of this G21, so to say. And in fact, I have just written an article for a website in which I have said that G21 will be India's Bharat movement. So truly, this is going to give you the I mean, in real politics, it will enable you to retrieve a lot of ground because you will be perceived as the championing the cause of the global south in real terms. Prime Minister Modi, what he did was, you will be surprised that on December, we took the baton for the G20. By 15th of December, he told his officers that you must have the meeting with the global south developing countries, and we must listen to their viewpoints. In January, first week, we had this meeting, virtual, 125 countries of the global south, Voice of Global South Summit. Most of them happen to be Africans, and they all participated in that. So their voices were heard. I mean, very often what happens is, like the United Nations and elsewhere, they take out the previous reports, dust it out, update it, and make it again. So it is easier to understand what are the problems of the world, developing world are. India has been a developing country in many senses. So we could have done it ourselves. But the fact that we try to engage them, to listen to them, to understand what are their concerns are, and how this is going to be then plowed back into the G20 mainstream, and that's given India a real push, so to say, in its effort. So you are championing the cause of the global south, which is a very important thing for you psychologically and substantively in both ways. At the same time, on a bilateral basis, on India-Africa, different forums and all, we are continuing to work with them. But this is, as I said, this is everybody. Americans have come out with their new Africa policy. The French also are trying to revive. China has also come out. Everybody is just trying to have a debt restructuring or writing off of the debts because they just can't pay, a large number of them. They don't have the money right now. But now today they are realizing that, we have to get together ourselves. They are no longer interested in the doles and the loans. They are interested in grants or joint ventures and collaborative things, which is a very different kind of thing that the Africans want for themselves. There are some leaders who might be still looking for billions of dollars and lines of credit and whatnot, but most of the countries don't want it. They don't want to be indebted any further. So there is a model that needs to be changed in different ways. As far as India is concerned, I think we can also do it. This can be our green field for our rupee debts or lines of credit in rupees. That will be extremely good because then we'll be able to export more, create capacities there and buy finished products because India is also the biggest consumer market today. So there is a lot of possibilities that we need to be doing. But in these countries, that's their main concern. And I think that is what we need to be watching on front foot. And if Prime Minister Modi's really, he has taken it upon himself. And I think that this will be a really crown in the jewel for us.
You actually stole my last question by mentioning the global south. So that was supposed to be the last one. But anyways, I have another small little question for you. Yeah. We have an outreach towards Eastern Africa, Mozambique, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya. We have a huge diaspora. Plus now there are reports about business interests which are going in, and a securing of energy, which is, I think, one of the biggest things today. And we also see that the French are helping us with that. There's Total Energies from France, which is doing a lot of stuff in link with some Indian developers also. How significant do you think this is, where you're trying to link them up with your supply chains? That gives them a certain sense of assurance of a constant supply of money as well. At the end of it, that's what an assurance that they would want. As you said, they don't want these aid and all that stuff. They want grants where they can actually start working, and this will be a constant source of revenue for them, which they can bank upon for their development goals or whatever they want to do. How significant do you think this model of working is, sir?
Well, I think that we have about 3 million Indian diaspora yes. in various countries. And I tell you a personal story. When I was in Nigeria, so Nigerian President Obasanjo often used to tell me, he said that, I know India better than you do, because he was trained in India, Indian Military Academy.
Yeah.
But he also used to say that the Indian industrialists here are the second largest employers after the federal government. Now you can imagine the kind of clout that you have, or the goodwill that you have. with that kind of an approach, that you're an employment generator, employment provider. And they're industrialists. I'm not talking about simply traders.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, Nigeria supplies 12% of our crude oil to us, 12%, which is nearly as big as many other countries. Then Angola is another country with which we have this. But what we are doing, and we also had oil blocks in these countries. You know, in many countries, including in Libya, at one time, eight blocks we had. Nigeria, we had about 6, 7 blocks. Mittals and OVL were working together. So, the energy is a domain which has to be collaborative by its very nature. At one time, when these countries were colonized, then it's only big companies, Total, Shell, BP, and all this. They all held these big blocks, and they controlled the production. But eventually, they'll have to cede this space. They have to collaborate with other countries because markets are India. China and India are the 2 big markets for this oil and gas. So obviously, this has to come to us. And then normally what happens is this is done through an exchanges and all those kind of things. You know, the oil is not directly supplied in that sense. But then India is working now not only with East Africa, but in different parts of Africa. Energy security is paramount for us. But then energy for development would be the model that will work well in Africa.
It has to be co-development sort of a thing.
Yes.
Ambassador, I am quite happy that we were able to link up. I know you're traveling from tomorrow, and yes. I'm glad I hooked on to you at the right time. So because this was a discussion that was probably missing in my platform, and you've brought in a lot of simplicity to a very complex problem. So I'd really humbly request you, if you can keep this relationship with this particular platform alive. We as citizens of this country need to listen to this, which is the reality, sans the rhetoric which flies around in most of the media channels. So thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I hope to see you back again very soon, sir. Till then.
There is something, Adi, thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking to you and meeting you also. But I must say that there is something I always say, that Africans are lovely people. Yeah. You know, they're just so loving and affectionate and very simple, whatever the inside, the outside. Some of them are very, very smart. So those are smart in the wrong way, I mean to say. So you have to be careful of that also, which is everywhere, in any country, you have those kind of people. But there is something very interesting about Africa, which I notice. That is, I call it as Afritude, the African attitude. Mm-hmm. And that's the most endearing part of Africa that you would love.
I guess the simplicity of people, sir?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in India, nowadays people don't want to wish you good morning, good afternoon, something. But there you go on the streets, and everybody will be very nicely, happily, chirpily greet you. You know, wow. So your day is made. Yeah, this is amazing. And that's what I found. Of course,
obviously there are different things, yes, sir. But yeah, I mean, as a general principle, if that is the simplicity and the humbleness of the continent.
And most importantly, you know, there is a great regard and love for India, affection for India.
Yeah, I know the music and stuff like that is pretty popular. Yeah. You see these.
Nigeria makes movies and all our serials. Everything is so very popular there in those countries. So at the cultural level, grassroots level, the Indian, I mean, Africa gave Gandhi to us.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you back very soon.
Thank you, Adi. It's a pleasure talking to you and to your audience.
Namaste. Jai Hind, sir.